Elliot just told me that I needed to buy my website domain so people couldn't take it and do bad things with it if my videos get popular on YouTube. I don't really think I'm in any danger of that. Also, we don't have Chaz with us tonight because she's with her grandparents. But she said, go ahead and read, and she'll watch it on YouTube. So, Chaz, I expect to see you comment below. Chapter 2. The tray Pemer was carrying was all that restrained him from jumping into the air and kicking his heels together in his jubilation. Working for Master Robinson, no matter how indirectly, and being apprenticed to Master Alodki was no loss of prestige and much, much more than he had dared contemplate. Not, Pemer admitted to himself, that he'd given much thought to his future. Of course, one never saw much of Master Alodki about the hall. He kept to the drum height, a lean, slightly stooped figure of a man with a big head and coarse, bristling brown hair that seemed to stand out from his skull to give him the appearance, the irreverent said, of one of his own bass drumsticks. Others insisted that he was deaf from years of pounding the great message drums for the Harper Hall. Except for drum beats, they hastily amended, which he didn't need to hear. He felt the vibrations in the air. Pemer considered his new apprentice.
Hearing? That's just hearing with extra steps.
Pemer considered his new apprenticeship and found it good. There were only 4 other apprentices, seniors all, and 5 journeymen serving Master Alodki. Granted that Pemer had been Master Schoeniger's special, but Master Schoeniger was responsible for every singer in the hall, whereas Master Alodki rarely had more than 10 harpers looking to him. Pemer, again, was in a select group, even more select if he'd been permitted to announce the full truth. He skittered down the steps, balancing the tray deftly. Maybe, once he'd proved to the Master Harper that he could keep his mouth sealed. And Master Robinson was wrong to think that any could extract information from Pemer that Pemer didn't care to divulge. Nothing pleased Pemer more than knowing. He didn't necessarily have to show off to other people how much he knew. The fact that he, Pemer, an insignificant herdsman's son from Crom, knew was sufficient. He wished he hadn't been so brash, mentioning the southern continent, but the reactions had proved that his guess was accurate. They had been down to the south. At least Sabel had, and probably Manoli. If they'd gone, then the Harper needn't risk the trip with such eyes and ears to do the hard work. Pemer hadn't had much to do with the old-timers before Flar had ordered them exiled to the southern continent. For this he was fervently grateful, as he'd heard enough about their arrogance and greed. But if he, Pemer, had been exiled, he wouldn't have just stayed put. He couldn't understand why the old-timers had quietly accepted their humiliating dismissal. Pemer calculated that some 248 old-timers and their women had gone to the southern continent, including the 2 dissatisfied weir leaders, Tron of Fort and Tukul of the High Reaches. 17 old-timers had returned north, accepting Bendon as their leader, or so Pemer had heard. Most of the exiled men and dragons had been well on in turns, so there were no real loss to the dragon strength of Pern. Old age and sickness had claimed almost 40 dragons in the first turn, and almost as many had gone between this turn. Somehow that struck Pemer as being rather careless of dragons, even old-timer ones. He stopped abruptly, aware of a tantalizing aroma wafting from the kitchen. Bubbly berry pies, and just when he needed a real treat. His mouth began to water in anticipation. The pies must be just out of the bake-oven, or surely he would have discerned that fragrance before. He heard Sylvina's voice rising above the working noises and grimaced. He could have gotten a few pies out of Abuna with no trouble, but Sylvina wasn't often taken in by his starts and schemes. Still, he let his shoulders sag, dropped his head, and began to shuffle down the last few steps into the kitchen level. Pemer, what are you doing here at this hour? Why do you have the harper's tray? You should be rehearsing. Sylvina took the tray from his hands and stared at him accusingly. You didn't hear? Pemer asked in a low, dejected voice. Hear? Hear what? How could anyone hear anything in this babble? She slipped the tray onto the nearest work surface and, putting her finger under his chin, forced his head up. Pemer was rather pleased to be able to squeeze moisture from the corners of his eyes. He narrowed them quickly, for Sylvina wasn't easily fooled. Though, he told himself hastily, he was very sorry he wouldn't be singing Domic's music. And he was sorrier that Tilgan was. Your voice? Your voice is changing. Pemer heard the regret and dismay in Sylvina's hushed tone. It occurred to him that women's voices never did change, and that she couldn't possibly imagine his feelings of total loss and crushing disappointment. More tears followed the first. There, lad, the world's not lost. In a half-turn or less, your range will settle again. Master Domic's music was just right for me. Pemer did not need to fake the ragged tones. To be sure, since he wrote it with you in mind, scamp. Well, wouldn't you know? Though I can't for the life of me believe you could contrive to change your voice to spite Domic. Spite Master Domic? Pemer widened his eyes with indignation. I wouldn't do such a thing, Sylvina. Only because you couldn't, rascal. I know how you hate singing female parts. Her voice was acerbic, but her hand under his chin was gentle. She took a clean corner of her apron and blotted the tears on his cheeks. As luck would have it, I seem to be prepared with an easement for your tragedy. She propelled him before her, motioning towards the trays of cooling pies. Pemer rapidly wondered if he ought to dissemble. You can have 2, 1 for each hand, and then away with you. Have you seen Master Schonager yet? Watch those pies, they're just out of the oven. He replied, biting into the first pie despite her admonition. It's the only way to eat 'em, he mumbled through a mouthful so hot that he had to suck in cool air to ease the burning of his gums. But I'm to get warehide clothes. You in warehide? Why would you need warehide? She frowned suspiciously at him now. I'm to study drum with Master Elliot, and Manoli asked me could I ride runners, and Master Robinson said I was to ask you for warehide. All 3 of them in it. And you to be apprenticed to Master Elliot? Sylvina considered the matter and then eyed him shrewdly. He wondered should he tell Manoli that Sylvina hadn't been taken in by their stratagem of making him a drummer. Well, I suppose you'll be kept out of mischief, though I, for one, doubt it's possible. Come on, then. I do have a warehide jacket that might fit. She cast him a calculating look as they moved toward the storage section of the kitchen level. Let's hope it'll fit for a while, because sure as eggs hatch, I shan't be able to pass it on to anyone else the way you mangle your clothes. Pemer loved the storerooms, redolent with the smell of well-cured hides and the eye-smarting acridity of newly dyed fabrics. He liked the glowing colors of the cloth bales, the jumble of boots, belts, packs hanging from hooks about the walls, the boxes with their odd treasures. Sylvina rapped his knuckles with their keys several times for opening lids to investigate. The jacket fit, the stiff new leather buckle against his thighs as he pranced about, swinging his arms to make the shoulders settle. It was long in the body, but Sylvina was pleased. He'd need the length. Fitting him with new boots showed her how ragged his trousers were, so she found him 2 new pairs, one in Harper blue and the other in a deep gray leather. 2 shirts with sleeves too long, but which no doubt would fit him perfectly by midwinter, a hat to keep his ears warm and his eyes shaded, and heavy riding gloves with down-lined fingers. He left the stores, his arms piled high with new clothes, boots dangling from their laces over his shoulder and bumping him front and back, his ears ringing with Sylvina's promise of dire things happening to him if he snagged, tore, or scuffed his new finery before he'd had it on his back a 7-day. He happily employed the rest of the morning by dressing in his new gear, examining himself from all angles in the one mirrored surface of the apprentice dormitory. He heard the burst of shouts as the chorus was released and peered cautiously over the sill. Most of the boys and young men swarmed across the court to the hall, but Master Domic, music rolled in one fist, strode purposefully toward Master Schonager's hall. The last to exit was Tilgan, head bowed, shoulders slumped, weary from what must have been an exhausting rehearsal. Pemer grinned. He had warned Tilgan to study the part. One never knew when Master Domic might call on the understudy. There was always the chance of a bad throat or a hacking cough for a soloist. Not that Pemer had ever been sick for performance. Until this one. Pemer gave a sour note. He really had wanted to sing Lessa in Domic's ballad. He'd sort of counted on coming to the Bend and Weir Women's notice that way. It was always wise to be known to the 2 Bend and Weir leaders, and this would have been the perfect opportunity. Ah well, there were more ways of skinning a herd beast than shaving him with a table knife. He folded his new clothing carefully in his bed press, giving the fur a smoothing twitch. Then he quickly glanced out the window again. Now, while Master Domick was busy with Master Schoneger, would be the time for him to slip into the dining hall. Keep out of sight, and soon enough he'd be out of Domick's mind. Not that Pemer was at fault. This time. A shame, really. Lessa's melody was the loveliest Domick had ever written. It had so suited his range. Once again a lump pushed up into his throat at the sadness of the lost opportunity. And probably a turn before he could try to sing again. Nor was there a guarantee that he'd have anywhere near as good a singing voice as an adult as he'd had as a boy. None at all. He'd miss being able to astonish people with the pure tone he could produce, the marvelous flexibility, the perfect sense of pitch and timing, not to mention his particularly acute skill at note reading. His reflections caused him sufficient pangs of regret so that, when he drifted past the first group of apprentices in the court, they paused in their play and watched his slow progress with awed silence. He trudged up the steps, past apprentices and journeymen, eyes down, hands flopping at his sides, the picture of dejection. Scorch it! Would he have to pretend to have lost his appetite? He could smell roast wary, succulent and dripping with juices, and then berry pies. However, if he managed his table-mates adroitly, hunger warred with greed, and there was nothing feigned about his expression of sad reflection when the dining room began to fill. Pemer, deep in his plans, was aware of being flanked by silent boys, but the chubby fist visible on the left was Brawley's. The stained, dirty, callous, nail-bitten hand on the right was Timony's. His good friends were standing by him in this moment of loss. He let out a long, draggling sigh, heard Brawley shift his feet uncomfortably, saw Timony extend his hand tentatively to draw it back slowly, uncertain how a gesture of sympathy would be received. Well, Timony might just give him both pies, Pemer thought. Suddenly everyone moved, and a quick glance at the round table told Pemer that Master Robinson had taken his place. A flash of blue and gray past his lowered eyes was probably Manoli moving to take her place at a journeyman's table. Ranley and Bond sat directly opposite Pemer, regarding him with wide and worried eyes. He gave them a sad half-smile. When the platter of roast wary slices came to him, he heaved another sigh and fumbled for a slice. He stared at it on his plate instead of attacking it immediately. But then generally he'd have taken as many slices as he could knife onto his plate without raising uproars from his mates. He did like roast tubers, but restrainedly took only a small one. He ate slowly so that his stomach would think it was getting more. A rumbling belly would ruin his ploy for bubbly pies. None of his friends spoke, either to him or to each other. At their end of the table, gloomy silence prevailed, until the bubbly pies were served. Pemer maintained his air of tragic indifference as the first ripple of delighted surprise sighed down from the kitchen end of the table. He could hear the rise of happy voices, the quick interest of his friends as they saw the burden of the sweet tray. "Pemer, it's bubbly pies," said Timony, pulling at his sleeve. Bubbly pies? Pemer kept a querulous note in his voice, as if even bubbly pies had no magic to revive him. "Yes, bubbly pies," said Brawley, determined to rouse him. "Your very first favorite, Pemer," said Bonds. "Here, have one of mine," he added, and, with only an infinitesimal show of reluctance, pushed the coveted pie across to Pemer. "Oh, bubbly pies," repeated Pemer, on the end of a quavering, semi-interested sigh, and picked up one of the offerings as though he was forcing himself to exhibit interest. "It's an awfully good bake, Pemer." Ranley bit into his with exaggerated relish. "Just take a bite, Pemer, you'll see. Get a bubbly or two inside and you'll feel more like yourself." Imagine Pemer not wanting all the bubblies he can eat. Ranley glanced at the others, urging them to second him. Bravely, Pemer ate slowly of the first bubbly pie, wishing they were still hot. "That did taste good," he said with a trifle brighter tone, and was promptly encouraged to eat another. By the time he had consumed 8, because 3 more were donated from the other end of the table, Pemer affected to lose the edge of his gloom. After all, 10 bubbly pies, when he might only have had 2, was a good day's scrounge. The journeyman rose to deliver announcements and assignments. Pemer toyed with the notion of several different reactions to the news of his change in status. Shock, yes. Delight? Well, some because it was an honor, but not too much, otherwise they might doubt the performance that had won so many pies. Sheriff's report to Master Schoneger. Sheriff! Surprise, shock, and consternation, totally unrehearsed or anticipated, brought Pemer straight up off the bench and prompted his neighbors to seize him by the shoulders and push him down. Sheriff! That little snip! That wet-eared, wet-bottomed, wet-bedded... Timony clamped his hand firmly over Pemer's mouth, and the next few announcements were lost to that section of the apprentice tables. Indignation revitalized Pemer, but he was no match for the concerted efforts of Timony and Brawley, determined that their friend should not suffer the extra humiliation of a public reprimand for interrupting the journeyman. "Did you hear, Pemer?" Bonds was saying, leaning across the table. "Did you not hear? I heard that Sheriff is to be Master..." Pemer was sputtering with rage. "There were a few truths Master Schonager ought to know about Sheriff." No! About you!" "Me?" Pemer ceased his struggles, abruptly horrified by the sudden thought that maybe Master Robinson had changed his mind, that some further investigation had led him to believe Pemer was unsuitable, that all the morning's bright prospect would be wrenched from his grasp. You're to report to..." And Bonds paused to give additional weight to his final words. "Master Alodki." "To Master Alodki?" Relief gave Pemer's reaction genuine force. Then he looked wildly around for the drum master. Bonds' elbow suddenly digging into his ribs alerted him, and there was Dearson, Master Alodki's senior journeyman, staring down at them, fist against his belt, a wary and disapproving expression on his weathered face. "So we get saddled with you, eh, Pemer? I'll tell you this, you watch your step with our master. Quickest man in the world with a drumstick, and he doesn't always use it on the drums." He eyed Pemer significantly, and then, with a sharp gesture, indicated that Pemer should follow him.